The engine screamed like nothing Corporal James Harker had ever heard before. It was the morning of August 7th, 1944. Somewhere between the hedgerows of Normandy and the open killing fields south of Mortain, and his M4 Sherman tank was doing something no Sherman was ever designed to do, outrunning German armor in a straight sprint across French farmland. Behind him, through the dust cloud kicked up by 30 tons of American steel moving at impossible speed, he could count the dark shapes. 14 Panzer IV and Panther tanks, their long-barreled 75mm and 88mm guns tracking his movement, closing the distance that should have been closed already. The fuel mixture sloshing in his tank's belly wasn't in any technical manual. It wasn't approved by any ordnance officer. It was born from three things: desperation, a mechanic's intuition about combustion, and the absolute certainty that regulation fuel would get them all killed in the next 5 minutes. Harker had poured aviation gasoline meant for P-47 Thunderbolts into a tank designed to run on 80-octane motor fuel, creating a volatile mixture that was either going to give them the speed they needed or turn their Sherman into a fireball before the Germans got the chance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The thing about being a tank mechanic in the 3rd Armored Division in the summer of 1944 was that you learned very quickly that the M4 Sherman you were assigned to maintain was built for a war that no longer existed. Every specification, every design choice, every engineering decision had been made in 1941 and 1942, when American planners assumed they would face Italian tanks in North Africa or Japanese light armor in the Pacific. Nobody had told the Sherman that by August of 1944 it would be facing the most advanced tank destroyers and heavy armor that German engineering could produce, machines designed specifically to kill Shermans at ranges where the Sherman couldn't effectively fight back. James Harker had grown up in Dearborn, Michigan, where his father worked the assembly lines at Ford's River Rouge plant. He'd learned to read engine sounds before he learned to read music, could diagnose a misfire by ear from 30 feet away, and understood that every engine had a personality shaped by its fuel, its compression, and the temperature it ran at. When he'd been drafted in 1942 and assigned to armored forces, he'd assumed his mechanical knowledge would be useful. What he hadn't anticipated was that it would become the difference between survival and a burning death inside a steel coffin. The Sherman's official designation was Medium Tank M4. It weighed 33 tons in its most common variant, was powered by a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine producing 400 horsepower, and could theoretically reach a maximum speed of 25 miles per hour on level ground. Its main armament was a 75mm M3 gun that could penetrate about 3 inches of armor at 500 yards under ideal conditions. These specifications had made sense when the tank was designed. They made considerably less sense when facing a German Panther tank, which weighed 45 tons, could reach 25 miles per hour despite its weight, mounted an immensely powerful 75mm gun that could penetrate over 5 inches of armor at the same range, and had frontal armor so thick that a Sherman's main gun literally could not harm it from any angle except the sides or rear. American tank crews in Normandy had learned this disparity the hard way. The official U.S. Army analysis, conducted after the campaign and later declassified, calculated that it took an average of 5 Sherman tanks to knock out a single German Panther, and that 4 of those 5 Shermans would be destroyed in the process. The mathematics of tank warfare in France in 1944 were brutally simple. If you were in a Sherman and you encountered German heavy armor, your best chance of survival wasn't to fight. It was to run, and to use every advantage of terrain, smoke, and speed you could muster to break contact before those long German guns found their range. Harker's crew, Commander Lieutenant Thomas Dennison, Gunner Sergeant Paul Vickers, Loader Private First Class Mike Chen, and Driver Corporal Robert Bobby Lynch, had survived 6 weeks in Normandy by understanding this fundamental truth. They had learned to fight from ambush positions. They had learned to target the vulnerable sides and rears of German armor. They had learned that the Sherman's one true advantage was its mechanical reliability and its ability to maneuver quickly through terrain that would bog down a heavier Panther or Tiger. And they had learned, through trial and error and the loss of too many friends and too many burning tanks, exactly how far they could push their M4 before the engine would overheat, the transmission would fail, or the suspension would collapse under combat stress. What Harker had begun experimenting with, quietly and without telling anyone outside his crew, was fuel mixing. The practice wasn't invented by him. Tankers had whispered about it since North Africa, mechanics had tried variations in Italy, and there were rumors that some Soviet T-34 crews did something similar on the Eastern Front. But it was dangerous, unauthorized, and required a level of mechanical intuition that most crews simply didn't possess. Get the mixture wrong and you could seize your engine. Get it too rich and you'd burn through your fuel load in half the expected time. Get it right, however, and you could coax performance out of a Sherman that Chrysler's engineers had never imagined. The basic principle was simple chemistry. The Continental R975 engine in the Sherman was designed to run on 80-octane gasoline, the same fuel used in most American military vehicles. This fuel was stable, relatively safe, and produced consistent power output. But it wasn't optimized for high-performance operation. Aviation gasoline, on the other hand, the 100-octane fuel used in American fighters and bombers, had a higher energy density and better anti-knock properties. It allowed engines to run at higher compression ratios and higher temperatures without detonating prematurely. Fighter planes needed this because they operated at variable altitudes and extreme performance envelopes. Tanks, according to official doctrine, did not. Harker had first tried mixing aviation fuel into his Sherman's tank in late July, after his unit had been attached to an airfield support operation near St. Lo. The P-47 Thunderbolt fighters stationed there used 100-octane fuel, and Harker had managed to fill 2 jerry cans from their fuel dump during a resupply operation. He'd done the mathematics in his head. The Continental engine's compression ratio was 6.4 to 1, low enough that it shouldn't knock even with higher octane fuel, and the increased energy density might give them an extra 2 or 3 miles per hour in top speed. It wasn't much, but in tank combat, 3 miles per hour could be the difference between presenting your vulnerable side armor for 5 seconds or for 8 seconds as you maneuvered for position. The first test had been cautious. A 70-30 mix of regular fuel to aviation gas, run during a routine patrol where they weren't expecting contact. The engine had run hotter, just as Harker had predicted, but the temperature had stayed within acceptable limits. More importantly, the Sherman had felt more responsive. The acceleration was sharper. The top speed, measured against landmarks on a known road, was at least 2 miles per hour faster than normal. Dennison, the tank commander, had noticed immediately. "What did you do to my tank, Harker?" he'd asked over the intercom. Harker had explained. Dennison had been silent for a long moment, then said simply, "Keep doing it. But if the engine catches fire, I'm telling them it was your idea." By early August, Harker had refined his mixture to 60% standard fuel and 40% aviation gasoline. He'd learned to adjust the carburetor slightly, to lean out the mixture, and prevent fouling the spark plugs. He'd discovered that the engine ran best when he let it warm up for an extra 2 minutes before putting it under load. And he'd confirmed, through careful testing, that the Sherman could now reach a sustained speed of 28 miles per hour on level ground, 3 miles per hour faster than its official maximum. And critically, fast enough to outpace a Panther tank that was maneuvering through rough terrain. The crew had used this advantage twice in small engagements, breaking contact when they'd stumbled into superior German forces. Both times, the extra speed had allowed them to reach defilade, a ridge line or tree line that broke the German line of sight, before the enemy could get more than 1 or 2 ranging shots off. Both times, they'd survived situations that should have gotten them killed. and both times the rest of their platoon had noticed that Harker's tank seemed to move just a little bit faster than it should, though nobody had quite asked the right questions yet. On the morning of August 7th, 3rd Armored Division had been tasked with a reconnaissance in force south of Mortain, where intelligence suggested the Germans were massing armor for a counterattack. The operation was supposed to be a probing action. Move forward, locate the German positions, call in artillery, and withdraw before making contact with heavy armor. It was the kind of mission that looked simple on a map and became infinitely more complicated when you were actually in a 33-ton steel box moving through Norman hedgerow country, where visibility extended about 50 yards in any direction, and every intersection could hide a German anti-tank gun. Harker's tank was the 3rd vehicle in a column of 5 Shermans from B Company. They'd been moving south along a dirt road between 2 hedgerows when the lead tank, commanded by Captain Morrison, had crested a small rise and immediately called contact. Multiple panzers, direct front, range 800 yards. The column had begun the standard contact drill, the lead tank reversing while the others maneuvered to find firing positions. But then Morrison's voice had come back over the radio, and this time there was something in his tone that made every crew member's blood run cold. Correction. Count 14 vehicles. Repeat, 14. Panthers and Mark IVs. We are heavily outnumbered. All units, break contact and withdraw to Rally Point Baker. 14 German tanks against 5 Shermans wasn't combat. It was execution. The mathematics were impossible. Even if every Sherman crew performed perfectly, even if they managed to knock out 2 or 3 German vehicles, they would be overwhelmed in minutes. The only rational response was what Morrison had ordered: immediate withdrawal, using smoke and terrain to break line of sight, and falling back to defensive positions where American artillery and air support could even the odds. But withdrawal in tank combat was never simple, especially in hedgerow country. The narrow roads between the hedgerows created natural choke points. If the German tanks reached the road first, they could block the American escape route and destroy the withdrawing Shermans one by one. The key to survival was speed, getting far enough ahead that the Germans would have to advance cautiously, worrying about ambush, giving the American tanks time to reach more favorable terrain. The column had begun its withdrawal, engines roaring as 5 Shermans reversed and then turned in the narrow road, a complex and dangerous maneuver under the best circumstances and nearly suicidal under fire. Harker had been monitoring his fuel gauge as Bobby Lynch wrestled their Sherman around. They were running on Harker's special mixture. He'd topped off the tank that morning with aviation fuel scrounged from another air support operation. The engine sounded different, angrier, a higher-pitched roar that spoke of increased RPMs and higher combustion temperatures. They were ready to run. The first German shell had impacted 50 yards behind them as Lynch got the Sherman pointed north and began accelerating. Harker, in his mechanic's position, couldn't see much of what was happening outside, but he could hear everything over the intercom. Dennison's voice, calling out targets and directions. Vickers confirming the turret was traversed to the rear, ready to engage if they had a shot. Chen, the loader, simply breathing hard, the sound of a man whose life expectancy was being measured in seconds and who knew it. And then Lynch's voice, tight with fear. "Sir, they're closing on us. I'm at maximum speed and they're still closing." That was when Harker had made his decision. The tank was running on a 60-40 mixture, which had been cautious, safe, the result of incremental testing. But caution was a luxury they no longer had. In the compartment next to Harker's position were 2 jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of pure 100-octane aviation gasoline. They were there because Harker had learned to always carry extra fuel in any form he could get it. The Continental engine's fuel tank held 175 gallons. If Harker could get that aviation fuel into the tank while they were moving, if he could push the mixture to 50-50 or even richer, he might be able to give Lynch the extra power they needed. The process was dangerous under any circumstances and borderline insane while the tank was moving at speed and under fire. Harker had to partially open the internal access panel to the fuel tank, insert a funnel into the fill port, and pour the jerry can's contents without spilling, because spilled high-octane fuel in an enclosed space with hot engine components meant fire, and fire in a tank meant death. His hands were shaking. The Sherman was bouncing over rough ground, the suspension crashing through its travel as Lynch pushed the tank as hard as it would go. Behind them, Harker could hear the distinctive crack of German 75mm and 88mm guns, each report meaning another shell arcing through the air toward American armor. He'd gotten the first jerry can open, wedged the funnel into place, and begun pouring. The aviation fuel splashed into the tank, its sharp chemical smell filling the crew compartment. 5 gallons disappeared into a 175-gallon tank. It barely moved the mixture ratio, but it was a start. Harker had grabbed the second jerry can, his muscles burning as he fought to keep his balance in the moving, bouncing tank. The second can had gone in faster, his technique improving with desperation. 10 gallons of pure aviation fuel. The mixture in the tank was now richer, maybe 55% standard fuel to 45% aviation gasoline. It was far beyond anything he'd tested. It was almost certainly going to damage the engine in the long run. But they didn't need the long run. They needed the next 10 minutes. "Bobby," Harker had said over the intercom, his voice steadier than he felt, "I've just changed our fuel mixture. Push the throttle all the way forward. Don't hold anything back. The engine's going to sound wrong, but trust me." Lynch hadn't questioned it. In combat, you trusted your crew or you died. The Sherman's engine note had changed almost immediately as the richer fuel mixture entered the carburetor. The pitch went higher, the exhaust note sharper. The temperature gauge began climbing into the red, and the Sherman began to accelerate. Tank speed in combat conditions is different from speed on a test track. Official specifications assume level ground, optimal conditions, careful operation. Combat means rough terrain, desperate maneuvers, mechanical stress that no peacetime test would ever replicate. The Sherman's official maximum speed of 25 miles per hour was achievable for a few minutes at a time under ideal conditions. Harker's carefully tested 60-40 mixture had given them 28 miles per hour sustained. What he'd just created, this dangerous, untested 50-50 mixture with the carburetor wide open and the engine screaming, was pushing the Sherman to speeds that shouldn't have been possible. 30 miles per hour, 32. The Sherman was shaking, every rivet and weld joint vibrating with the strain. The engine temperature was climbing past safe limits, the needle well into the red zone that meant imminent mechanical failure. But they were pulling away. Behind them, through the dust and the smoke, the German tanks were growing smaller. Panthers could reach 25 miles per hour, but that was their theoretical maximum. And they were moving through the same rough terrain, same obstacles. The Panzer IVs were slightly faster on paper but heavier in practice. And the Americans had one advantage the Germans didn't: desperation and a mechanic who understood exactly how much abuse a Continental R975 engine could take before it gave up entirely. The pursuit had lasted 11 minutes, though it felt like hours. 11 minutes of the Sherman running at speeds it was never designed for, burning through fuel at a catastrophic rate. The engine temperature so high that Harker could feel the heat through the armor plating. 11 minutes of German shells impacting around them, behind them, to the sides, walking closer as German gunners adjusted their range. 11 minutes of the crew saying nothing because there was nothing to say, each man focused on his job, knowing that survival depended on every component, every system, every decision working perfectly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They'd broken contact at a crossroads 3 kilometers north of the initial engagement. The pursuing German column had slowed as they approached the crossroads, wary of ambush. and in that moment of hesitation, the American tanks had gained enough distance to reach a tree line. Dennison had ordered smoke, and white phosphorus grenades had created a wall of concealment. By the time the smoke cleared, the American tanks were gone, dispersed into separate covered positions where German artillery couldn't target them effectively. Harker's Sherman had rolled into a small depression behind a stone wall, and Lynch had finally eased off the throttle. The engine had continued running, but barely. The temperature gauge was beyond red, into ranges where the metal itself was starting to break down. Harker had immediately begun shutdown procedures, knowing that they needed to cool the engine before permanent damage set in. Oil pressure was dropping, a sign that the oil itself was breaking down from the heat. The spark plugs were almost certainly fouled. The piston rings had probably warped. By every reasonable standard, the engine should have seized, should have exploded, should have failed catastrophically at some point during that 11-minute sprint. But it hadn't. They were alive. The rest of B Company's tanks had made it out as well, though Captain Morrison's tank had taken a glancing hit that had damaged its track and forced it to be towed. Of the 5 tanks that had made contact with the German column, 5 had survived. The fuel mixture that Harker had improvised, unauthorized, dangerous, based on intuition and desperation rather than engineering calculation, had given them the margin of survival they needed. When Dennison had finally climbed out of the tank and walked around to inspect it, he'd found Harker already checking the engine, his hands black with oil and carbon. The lieutenant had looked at the temperature gauge, still showing well above normal even after cooling, and then at Harker. "How bad is it?" he'd asked. "We need a new engine," Harker had said flatly. "This one's done. Piston rings are shot, cylinder walls are probably scored, the oil's contaminated. We ran it so hot that I'm surprised the whole thing didn't seize." "But we're alive," Dennison had said. "Yes, sir, we're alive." The story of what Harker had done, the improvised fuel mixture, the desperate sprint, the Sherman that had outrun 14 pursuing German tanks, had spread through B Company that evening, passed from crew to crew during the precious hours when they had fallen back to defensive positions and waited for the anticipated German counterattack. The reaction had been mixed. Some mechanics had been horrified at the risk, pointing out that Harker could have killed his entire crew if the engine had caught fire or exploded. Others had been intrigued, asking about the specific mixture ratio, the carburetor adjustments, the symptoms to watch for. The officers had been carefully neutral, recognizing that Harker had violated every fuel regulation and maintenance protocol, but had also saved 5 lives in the process. The German counterattack had come the next day, the operation that would later be known as Operation Lüttich, Hitler's desperate attempt to break through American lines and reach the coast at Avranches. The German force that B Company had encountered was part of that larger attack, a reconnaissance element from the 2nd SS Panzer Division probing American positions. The 14 tanks that had pursued Harker's column had been just a fraction of the German armor committed to the operation. Over the next week, the Battle of Mortain would involve hundreds of tanks on both sides, one of the largest armored engagements of the Normandy campaign. But for Harker and his crew, the battle had already been fought and won in those 11 minutes when their Sherman had done something it shouldn't have been able to do. The tank itself, its engine destroyed by the strain, was towed back to a maintenance depot where it was stripped for parts. The crew was assigned a new Sherman, this one fresh from a supply depot, its engine pristine and its specifications exactly as Chrysler had intended. Harker had never attempted the 50-50 fuel mixture again. The risk was too high, the potential for catastrophic failure too great. But he had continued to experiment with more conservative mixtures, the 60-40 ratio that had proven reliable, sometimes a 65-35 ratio when he could get aviation fuel. And he'd shared his knowledge with other mechanics in the division, carefully explaining the principles, the risks, the symptoms to watch for. The practice had spread quietly, passed from one maintenance crew to another, never officially sanctioned but never quite forbidden either. The historical record of this practice is scattered and fragmentary. Official U.S. Army maintenance reports from Normandy make no mention of fuel mixing. It was, after all, a violation of regulations, and crews had every reason not to document it officially. But post-war interviews with tank mechanics and veterans contain references to the practice. A 1994 oral history interview with Robert Lynch, the driver of Harker's Sherman, confirmed the basic facts of the Mortain incident. A technical analysis conducted by the U.S. Army's Armored School at Fort Knox in 1948 mentioned in passing that field mechanics had sometimes experimented with fuel additives to enhance performance, though it gave no specifics. The reason the practice worked at all had to do with the fundamental design of the Continental R975 engine. It was an air-cooled radial engine, originally designed for aircraft use, which meant it had been engineered with significant thermal margins. Aircraft engines needed to handle extreme variations in temperature, altitude, and operating conditions. The version installed in the Sherman had been somewhat derated. Its compression ratio was lower, its maximum RPM was reduced, but the fundamental robustness remained. This meant the engine could tolerate abuse that would destroy a purpose-built vehicle engine. The higher octane aviation fuel increased the energy available per combustion cycle. This translated directly into more power output from the same engine displacement. The Continental R975 produced 400 horsepower on 80-octane fuel. With 100-octane fuel, assuming optimal conditions and ignoring the increased thermal stress, it could theoretically produce closer to 440 or 450 horsepower. That extra power, pushed through the Sherman's transmission and final drive, translated into higher top speed and better acceleration. The price for this performance was heat and engine wear. Higher combustion temperatures meant faster degradation of engine oil, increased thermal stress on metal components, greater risk of detonation or pre-ignition that could destroy pistons. A Sherman engine running on pure aviation fuel might gain 15% more power, but would lose 30 or 40% of its operational lifespan. For peacetime operation or long-term reliability, the trade-off made no sense. For a crew being pursued by 14 German tanks and facing death in the next few minutes, it was the only rational choice. The broader context of this story, individual American innovation versus German technical superiority, played out across the Normandy campaign in countless small ways. The Sherman tank, as a weapons system, was inferior to German heavy armor in almost every measurable way. It had thinner armor, a less powerful gun, and a higher profile that made it easier to spot and target. German crews called Shermans Tommy Cookers or Ronsons after the cigarette lighter, because they had a reputation for catching fire when hit. The official U.S. Army analysis estimated that American tank crews in Normandy had roughly a 50% chance of being wounded or killed during their first month of combat. And much of that casualty rate came from encounters with superior German armor. But the Sherman had advantages that weren't apparent from looking at specifications. It was mechanically reliable, in a way that German tanks simply weren't. A Sherman could run for days with minimal maintenance. A Panther or Tiger required hours of maintenance for every hour of operation, and their complex transmissions and suspensions frequently broke down under combat conditions. The Sherman was produced in vast numbers. Over 49,000 were built during the war, compared to about 6,000 Panthers and 1,300 Tigers. And perhaps most importantly, the Sherman was designed to be modified, maintained, and operated by average soldiers with reasonable training, not by elite specialists. American tank crews, faced with a machine that was good enough but not excellent, responded by making it better in whatever ways they could. They welded extra armor plates onto vulnerable points. They mounted additional machine guns for anti-infantry work. They experimented with ammunition, tactics, and yes, fuel mixtures. The Sherman tank that emerged from this process of field modification was often significantly different from the factory specifications, adapted to the specific conditions and threats that crews faced. Harker's fuel mixing was one example of this adaptive innovation. There were others. Some crews in the 3rd Armored Division had begun carrying extra track sections welded to the front of their Shermans as makeshift additional armor. Others had developed techniques for firing white phosphorus shells directly into the vision ports of German tanks, blinding the crew and forcing them to button up. Still others had learned to work in coordinated teams where one Sherman would deliberately expose itself to draw German fire, while 2 others maneuvered for flank shots. None of these adaptations made the Sherman equal to a Panther in a straight-up fight. But they narrowed the gap. They created situations where American advantages, numbers, mechanical reliability, tactical flexibility, could overcome German technical superiority. The mathematical equation of tank combat in Normandy, 5 Shermans to kill 1 Panther, with 4 Shermans destroyed, was terrible but survivable, because America could build 5 new Shermans faster than Germany could build 1 new Panther. Harker himself survived the war, though his Sherman did not. He would serve with the 3rd Armored Division through the breakout from Normandy, across France and into Germany. His personnel file, later declassified, shows that he was promoted to sergeant in September 1944 and received a commendation for exceptional mechanical knowledge and innovation under combat conditions in November of that year. The commendation made no specific mention of fuel mixing, but tankers who served with him knew what it referred to. After the war, Harker had returned to Michigan and, perhaps inevitably, found work in the automotive industry. He'd worked for General Motors for 27 years, specializing in engine development. In a 1978 interview for a local veterans group, he'd been asked about his wartime experience. He'd mentioned the Mortain incident briefly, describing it as the time we had to push the Sherman harder than it wanted to go. When pressed for details, he'd said simply, "We did what we had to do. The engine didn't like it, but we survived." The interviewer had asked if he'd been scared. Harker's response was telling. "I was too busy to be scared. I was watching the temperature gauge and listening to the engine and trying to figure out if we were going to blow a gasket or seize a piston before we got clear. The fear came later, after we'd stopped, and I had time to think about what could have gone wrong." This matter-of-fact description captures something essential about tank combat in World War II. The popular imagination often focuses on the dramatic moments, the gun duels, the explosions, the tactical maneuvering. But for many crew members, especially mechanics and drivers, combat was a technical problem to be solved under extreme pressure. It was about understanding your machine, knowing its limits, and making split-second decisions about how hard you could push it before something broke. The Sherman tank, despite its limitations, proved to be exactly the machine that fit this approach. It wasn't the best tank of the war by any objective measure, but it was reliable, adaptable, and forgiving of field modifications. It could be operated by mechanics like Harker who understood engines and were willing to experiment. And crucially, when something did break, it could be fixed relatively easily with standard parts and tools. The German tanks that pursued Harker's Sherman that morning in August 1944 were superior weapons in almost every way, but several of them almost certainly broke down during the pursuit or shortly after, victims of mechanical complexity and the strain of sustained high-speed operation. The Panthers, in particular, had chronic transmission problems. Their Maybach engines produced 700 horsepower, but that power was transmitted through a complex gearbox that frequently failed under combat stress. A Panther that broke down in the field often had to be destroyed by its own crew because it couldn't be recovered quickly enough. Harker's Sherman, by contrast, was towed to a maintenance depot, its engine replaced, and was back in service within a week. The crew's next tank served them through the rest of the Normandy campaign, across the Siegfried Line and into the Rhineland. It broke down twice, once for a thrown track that was repaired in 2 hours, and once for a fuel pump failure that took a day to fix.
Both repairs were done by field maintenance crews using standard replacement parts carried in supply trucks. This reliability, more than any single tactical innovation, was what allowed American armor to overwhelm German defenses. The German military in 1944 was fielding technically superior weapons but couldn't keep them running. The Americans were fielding adequate weapons but could keep them in the field continuously. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side that could maintain more combat-ready vehicles, even if those vehicles were individually inferior. The broader lesson of Harker's story that
desperate innovation could temporarily overcome technical disadvantage was something the U.S. military took to heart in the post-war period. The Army's Ordnance Department conducted extensive after-action studies of tank combat in Europe, interviewing hundreds of veterans and analyzing thousands of encounter reports. One consistent finding was that crew initiative and field modification often made the difference between survival and destruction. This led to changes in how American military vehicles were designed. Post-war tanks were engineered with easier access to engines and mechanical systems, specifically to enable field mechanics to perform modifications and repairs. Training programs for tank crews began emphasizing mechanical knowledge for all crew members, not just the designated mechanic. And maintenance doctrine shifted to accept that crews would modify their vehicles in the field, trying to channel that innovation rather than suppress it. The M4 Sherman remained in service with the U.S. military until the 1950s and continued to be used by Allied nations well into the 1970s. Various armies modified it in countless ways. The Israelis converted Shermans to carry 105mm guns. The British created specialized variants for mine clearing and bridge laying. The Argentinians updated the suspension and fire control systems. In every case, the Sherman proved to be what its designers had somewhat accidentally created, a platform that could be adapted, modified, and improved by the people who used it. Harker's specific innovation, mixing aviation fuel into tank engines, did not become standard practice. The risks were too high and the benefits too variable. But the principle behind it, that a good mechanic with deep understanding of his machine could coax extra performance when needed, became embedded in American armored doctrine. Modern American tanks like the M1 Abrams have complex engine management systems, but they also have override capabilities that allow crews to temporarily exceed normal operating parameters in emergency situations. The design acknowledges that sometimes survival requires pushing a machine beyond its specifications. The story also highlights something often overlooked in discussions of World War II tank combat: the psychological dimension of being in a mechanically inferior vehicle. Sherman crews knew they were outgunned and under-armored. They knew the statistics. They knew that encounters with German heavy armor often ended badly. This knowledge created a particular kind of stress that affected everything from tactical decisions to mechanical operations. Harker's willingness to experiment with fuel mixtures wasn't just mechanical curiosity. It was a response to the existential understanding that the standard Sherman, operated by the book, wasn't good enough. Every crew member felt this pressure to find any possible advantage, however small, that might improve their odds. Some crews focused on tactics. Others focused on additional armor. Harker focused on engine performance because that was what he understood. But the underlying motivation, the need to make the Sherman into something more than it was designed to be, was universal. This pressure produced innovation, but also casualties. Not every field modification worked. Some Sherman crews who tried to add extra armor made their tanks top-heavy and more likely to throw tracks. Others who experimented with ammunition loadouts created fire hazards. The line between clever adaptation and dangerous desperation was often thin, and crews crossed it more often than the historical record acknowledges. Harker was fortunate. His experimentation was grounded in genuine mechanical knowledge. He understood what he was doing to the engine, could monitor the results, and knew when to stop. Other mechanics tried similar experiments without the same foundation,
and sometimes paid the price. There are scattered references in maintenance reports to Sherman engines that had catastrophically failed due to unknown fuel contamination or unauthorized modifications. Some of those were probably failed attempts at fuel mixing. The 14 German tanks that pursued Harker's crew that morning represented a significant portion of the armored reconnaissance force committed to Operation Lüttich. Historical analysis of the battle suggests that this particular German column was from the 2nd SS Panzer Division, which had recently arrived in Normandy from the Eastern Front. These were experienced crews with months or years of combat experience, operating some of the best tanks Germany could produce. And yet they had failed to catch 5 American Shermans driven by crews with weeks or months of experience. Part of this was terrain. The hedgerows and narrow roads of Normandy favored the defender and complicated pursuit. Part was tactics. American doctrine emphasized breaking contact and avoiding unfavorable engagements. But part, a small but critical part, was that one American mechanic had figured out how to make his Sherman just fast enough to stay ahead of pursuit for the 11 minutes it took to reach safety. Operation Lüttich ultimately failed. The German armored thrust was stopped by American artillery, air power, and determined defensive fighting. The operation cost Germany hundreds of tanks and thousands of experienced crew members that it could not replace. The American forces, by contrast, absorbed their losses and continued operations within days. Shermans that were knocked out were replaced by new ones arriving from supply depots. Crews that took casualties were reconstituted with replacements. The mechanical and industrial superiority that Harker's innovation had temporarily provided on a tactical level was reflected strategically in America's ability to sustain armored operations indefinitely. The personal cost of tank combat was something Harker rarely discussed in detail. In the 1978 interview, he mentioned that of the 5-man crew that had served with him at Mortain, 3 had been wounded at various points during the campaign, and 1 had been killed during the fighting in Germany in March 1945. These statistics were typical for Sherman crews, roughly 50% casualty rates over a full campaign, with roughly half of casualties being fatalities. The psychological impact of knowing these statistics while still having to climb into a Sherman every morning was something that affected every American tanker. They dealt with it in various ways. Some became fatalistic. Others focused intensely on small rituals and superstitions. Many, like Harker, channeled their anxiety into trying to improve their odds through whatever means available. Better maintenance, better tactics, better anything that might shift the survival equation even slightly in their favor. The fuel mixing experiment was, in this light, as much psychological as mechanical. It gave Harker something to control in a situation where so much was beyond control. He couldn't make German tanks less deadly. He couldn't make the Sherman's armor thicker or its gun more powerful. But he could adjust fuel mixtures, monitor engine performance, and create a small margin of advantage through technical understanding. That sense of agency, however limited, was psychologically crucial. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.